Well, thanks, Dr. Kovacic. I basically started with Alcon Labs back in 1986, spent about 28 and a half years with Alcon in various different positions, from sales to marketing, and finished my career in professional relations and academic education, if you will, with all the optometry schools. So, fairly extensive background in the eye care business, and fortunately I was able to work with you and the board. I was invited to be a consultant to the First Eye Care Board, and was able to hopefully provide some guidance into the big picture of eye care as the board was making some decisions on the organization and the buying group, etc. So was real happy to do that, and real excited to have this opportunity to share some thoughts on where I see some really great opportunities for First Eye Care itself as the organization moves forward in the buying group. So specifically, we had chatted a little bit about how First Eye Care started, and if correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, but I think it was a small group of docs that got together on a regular basis, kind of like what we used to call study groups or peer-to-peer groups. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
And remind me, how far back was that? Do you remember when?
That was probably back in the mid '80s. Is kind of when we started that.
Okay.
And so it kind of slowly grew, and then into the larger group that it is now. So yeah, and if you'd I know we talked earlier a little bit. You mentioned you saw this in the industry, not only in our area but other parts of the country, and what you saw as a benefit of that.
Well, absolutely, and we used to call them study groups, and at Alcon we'd sponsor these groups as a vendor supporter to allow the docs to get together on a usually twice a year basis. And fortunately I was able to sit in a lot of those meetings, and it's very interesting. And I remember we had about 20 different groups across the country that we supported. Most of these groups were doctors who were non-competing in different markets, and they really shared their businesses from even the financials, and shared a lot of strategic decision-making ideas, and challenged each other with decision-making. And it was so beneficial that I look back over my career, and many of those doctors have since moved on or retired, but those were some of the largest practices in the U.S. that were part of these study groups. And study groups it's not a new idea. I mean, this has been around not just in eye care, but it's done in a lot of different industries. Peer-to-peer wisdom sharing is what I call it, because it allows individuals to feel not as isolated in their businesses or their practice, and to understand that everybody's kind of going through the same issues and the same challenges. But when everybody's talking about these and being very open about them, a lot of times you can hopefully circumvent going down the wrong path and preventing maybe an issue in the practice that if somebody else has had a problem, then they share that and say, hey, you might want to do that, you might want to go this direction. And if that's done quicker versus later, that goes right to the bottom line in decision making. But the thing is, you've got to commit to it. And part of it is you got to commit to being at the meetings, whether that's done every quarter or a couple times a year. You have to be consistent, and you have to be able to give and take. You got to be able to give in terms of sharing ideas, but also be able to take criticism and know that it's not just being said to be critical, but to help you. And those that do that usually, are very successful in their practices and in their business. So I just see a lot of upside, and I know as time goes on, docs move in and out of this, but there's a younger group of doctors that are involved in both First Eye Care as well as across the country, and I always encourage docs to get involved in these types of organizations. Usually groups of around a dozen is a sweet spot. It can be a little lighter, maybe 9 or 10, maybe a little bit bigger, 15, 16, but you get too big and then people clam up and don't participate. You get too small, there's not enough ideas to share. So about a dozen is a really wonderful size, and if that can be done regionally, where it's not too far to travel, that's great. The study groups that I talked about were done around major meetings, whether it's maybe you go down to the TOA, that's a great time to do a subgroup meeting along this line. And many times these meetings were just, it doesn't have to be all day, but if you can carve out at least 4 hours, I think that's a nice amount of time where everybody can share their ideas. But highly encourage those that aren't doing this sort of activity to do it. Now, Also, I'll look back at going through what we've done this past year with COVID. A lot of Zoom calls, a lot of interaction through the internet. That's a great way to overlay that so that we can have the live meetings, but maybe in between do a quick Zoom. About an hour and a half on Zoom is about as much as I can handle. So I would encourage those to be small in terms of the time allocation, but very focused. The other meetings, 4 hours to a full day, would be optimal if you can do that sort of thing. So I know there's been some talk of kind of rekindling that activity. I would highly encourage it, and I think you'll only find that it's just going to help the practice by participating in such a way. Well, I'll give you a fact on that, and this is as a result of a phone call just last night. I also serve on the board for the Southern College of Optometry in Memphis, Tennessee. And they have the Hayes Center, which is really a center built to help new grads find jobs, to help alumni find students that could come into the practice. It's really kind of built around practice management as well, so there's a lot of tools and services that are offered. Right now, at the college, through the Hayes Center, they have almost 1,800 optometric job openings, right? Wow. So with that, if you understand how many grads are coming out, there's been a lot of word on, well, there's too many optometry schools, too many optometrists coming out, we're flooding the market. There are more job opportunities and more dark doors around the country, or dark lanes where doctors would like to hire somebody that can't get them hired, than there are new grads coming out of school. So with that says opportunity, but we also have to look at the demographics, and this has been speaking for many, many years now, or at least for the last 10, there's an upswing on the demographics with the aging population and the greater need for eye care. That's playing right into optometry in terms of needs, the greater scope of practice that we're seeing with new legislation for optometry around the country. I think Massachusetts recently with glaucoma. There's been some recent changes in a few other states with expanded ability to treat various different eye conditions and disease states. This is all spells into opportunity again for the profession. It's a good time to be in eye care, and I think that's why you see a lot of the different groups trying to combine and grow that we see out there. Eye care is hot, and it's what we do with it, I think, that makes the difference. And so I'll circle back to these study groups and getting together on a regular basis with your peers. Such an invaluable thing, and highly encourage you to consider doing that. When I know Grant and Ken are thinking about making this a little bit more formalized coming out, and hopefully you'll participate on a regular basis with these sorts of groups within First Eye Care.
So how do you look at this opportunity as it relates to, let's say, the independent practice versus some of the larger chains? Is this good for everybody, or is it good for one section more than the other? How do you see that?
Referring to when you say...
when you were talking about the amount of jobs open versus the amount of optometrists that are available. It sounds like it's good opportunity.
It's across the board.
Across the board. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, across the board. The opportunities that we currently have through the Hayes Center at SCO, and I'm familiar with that because I see the data, it's across the board. Private practice, in fact, it's even higher skewed with private practice independence than it would be, we'll call it the traditional optical chains, your lens crafters, your Target Opticals, your Pearl Visions. It's more geared towards independent practice.
Because, the impression, at least the word I hear from a lot of my colleagues is that, independents are being squeezed out and it's phasing out. So I don't necessarily follow that trend of thought, but again, if you can expound on that a little bit from what you hear, do you see that happening or?
There's been a lot of consolidation. Everybody sees that. But at the same time, there's still new shingles being added in many, many markets around the country. Not as many as there were years and years ago when we didn't have any sort of group optical chains and corporate associations that we have today. But there's still a lot of new practices opening up, independent practices all over the country. So there's opportunity at every corner, and with every change, there's a reaction to that change. And I think that this is, as I said earlier, this is a wonderful time for eye care, and even a greater time for optometrists within eye care. You look at ophthalmology. They're being very, very, very focused on the surgical piece now, and they're relying more heavily on optometry to screen out those patients and feed them to surgical cases. We see that all the time, and we see that growing. So there's more of a specialization there, and there's more of a generalization with optometry serving really all of the eye care needs, other than cataract surgery and that sort of thing. So opportunities around every corner.